Thank you, everybody. I'm so honored to be a part of this summer session. I've been to several now, having been at UW for about 5 years, and it's always illuminating, interesting. I get so much out of it, so it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor for me to be moderating this conversation. I am, a little bit about me, I have been at UW for 5 years. I work within the Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity and in advancement in University Marketing Communications. So I started out with the Race and Equity Initiative and have done quite a bit in the communication space, especially when it comes to working on diversity, equity, inclusion, and now more importantly, anti-racism focused work. So I'm very excited to be talking to the people I'm talking to today because their work aligns so closely with what the mission and new vision and new developments and advancement are. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a longtime friend and colleague. First, I'll start with Brian Carter, and then I'll move to Ruth Dickey. Brian Carter is the Executive Director of King County for Culture, a cultural institution, and I'll let Brian talk a little bit more about that. But I met Brian 11 years ago. We were both early careers starting out at the Northwest African American Museum. And we worked in a very small nonprofit environment, and we had a lot to do to build up a community that cared about history, art, and culture in the Northwest, especially for the Black community and with the Black community. So that is my history with Brian Carter. So it's a real pleasure to bring him here and share, that he can share his knowledge with you all today. And Ruth Dickey is the Executive Director of the Seattle Arts and Lecture Organization. And I am very honored and proud to be on the board of that organization right now and liaise partnerships between UW and SAL as a lecture educational, as an educational organization, but as an organization that brings authors and thought leaders around so many different incredible present topics. I met Ruth at a Ta-Nehisi Coates event that Sal was producing and UW was sponsoring with a group, and we brought a group of students, and it was pretty amazing. So the work that Sal was doing to bring these incredible speakers to Seattle and to UW audiences is pretty incredible. So that's my bit of intro. Brian, do you have any opening thoughts before we dive into the discussion about transformational leadership?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for the warm introduction and for the invitation from the University of Washington. My graduate degree is from the University of Washington in Museum Studies. I worked at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture for a number of years, and I'm a season ticket holder for the Husky football team. So it's nice to be on the phone with some other Huskies. So good morning to everybody.
Thank you. And Ruth, have any opening thoughts? Thank you, Brian.
A huge thanks to Leilani for that really warm introduction and for inviting me to be part of the conversation today. I'm really excited to be here. I don't have nearly as many exciting UW connections as Brian does, but I'm very excited to be here with all of you. And I think I was at the community-centric fundraising conversation that Ruli held on Monday, which was so exciting. And I know that many of you heard from him earlier in your week. And I think this is such an exciting time to be having these conversations. So I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you both, and honored to have you here. So we're going to dive into the conversation, and I really want to tee up what we're going to talk about today. So aside from the session title, I really see this conversation about transformational leadership and how equity principles, anti-racism principles become part of the DNA of an organization and what the leader's role is in shaping that in collaboration with your stakeholders and community around you. So we're going to have people pose questions in the thought exchange and other spaces. We'll have some time for that after the discussion. And if anybody should have any questions, but I'm hoping that we can draw out some of this the leadership that goes into this work and how you're doing that in your own organizations. So we're going to start. I have a few questions, but take it away. I really do want to know, and I think for the rest of the group, if there was space for this discussion about equity, not just the discussion, but the actions behind it, the structures, the infrastructure behind it in your organizations when you came to them, or what journey took you to this work, and how are you shaping it within your organization? Ruth, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been at Seattle Arts and Lectures. It's actually 7 years this week. And when I came to the organization, it had been through a financial crisis, to be totally candid, and had gone from a staff of 11 down to a staff of 4, and was at a moment of kind of reinvention. So the bonus of being in crisis is there's space for lots of reinvention. As we kind of evolved the organization, our real equity journey began in earnest in 2015, which was the first time that we presented Ta-Nehisi Coates for his book, Between the World and Me. And we started really thinking deeply as an organization about what that book and that conversation called on us as an organization to do, and how it called on us to make change within our own organization, what our role was kind of in the world. And so from that point, we began a learning journey. We worked with consultants and did a lot of training and learning and thinking, and also work around evolving our public programs, working in our Writers in the Schools program, which works in public schools and at Children's Hospital, to center and prioritize the needs of communities and students of color. And then in our organization to become more reflective of the community and be more responsive to the community. And that's looked lots of different ways over time, which I'm happy to talk about more, but it's definitely been a learning journey. And I guess as I start this morning, I want to acknowledge that when Leilani first invited me to be part of the conversation today, my first reaction was, oh no, like we're not done. We have so much more work to do. I can't do that. And also, like, who am I be speaking about this as a white leader? And then I really thought about, how important it is that all of us, and particularly white leaders, are talking about this openly, are being brave and speaking about what we're learning, the mistakes we're making, what we're doing, and being accountable to communities as we engage in this work, and that it really is our work. So I'm glad to be here and to be part of this conversation, to be sharing.
Thank you so much for that. Brian, would you like to?
Sure. I think before I get to For Culture, I'll share a little bit about my background and the journey to For Culture, because I think it frames a mandate that I feel as a leader of the organization when it comes to racial equity. So as Leilani said, I started out at the Northwest African American Museum. My background has always been in history, and I feel that I'm a real product and I'm a legacy of the Black Museums movement. And inherent and a fundamental tenet of that movement is that any work that's done within the museum space is done in partnership and in tandem, and because of the community that surrounds that particular institution. So what was really important, and what I learned at a young age at the Northwest African American Museum, is that the relevance of the museum to its source community, to its surrounding community, is really the defining feature of its worth, its value. So I spent 10 years at that museum, and that was really drilled into me. And I was brought into a much larger community of African-American museums. And the ideas of accessibility, inclusion, equity were not things that were special and different and separate. They were integral to the way in which the museum actually could be birthed, that it could be sustained, and then it went about its work. So after about 10 years of working at that museum, I had a question, and that question was, these principles that are so foundational to the Black Museum movement, why and how, or why are those not more visible at large legacy white mainstream museums? And is it possible to try and transform those museums with some of the principles that I got working within Black museums? And that's when I moved to probably the largest legacy white institution on the West Coast, and that was the Oregon Historical Society. And my question was really, can I get in through the front door, get inside, and then kick the door down for accessibility for others? So bringing those principles, those lessons, and I think importantly, the strategies and tactics from my work at NAM to that space. So I feel like that was a lot of my work at the Oregon Historical Society. That was a lot of my work at the Burke as well. Just simply asking, what are the pressing issues and concerns that the community is facing at this moment? And then how and in which ways can the museum, its collections, its outreach, its public programming build bridges from those issues back to the museum rather than from the museum collection to the community, which I think is one of the problems within the cultural sector. And as I worked at these two institutions, it was troubling at times to talk about changes that were necessary when it came to accessibility and inclusion and equity in our practices, and to hear that we're not quite sure if funders are going to go along with that. And what do these changes mean for our donor base and for our visitors? And I came to understand how important it was that the values of funders in this particular moment are moving along, I think, with a more progressive and liberal agenda around racial equity. And at that point, I thought, well, now what would it look like to work in the funding space? And how could I perhaps help to shift the values of a funding organization such that it better aligned with what I thought were necessary changes within the cultural sector? So that's how I arrived at For Culture. So it's a great job. I love it, but I came there for a reason. And that's to make sure that the values of that funding organization align with the needs of communities, which is always an evolving process. It's always a lengthy process. And as Ruth said, you're never done. It's being in a consistent and active state of listening and humility for me. So that's what brought me to the organization. And that's why I wake up every day and just ask, are we doing as much as we can at the organization around racial equity? And towards that end, I mean, foundational to what we do now in our mission statement, we lead with a focus on racial equity. So that explicitness and that specificity about what we are, what we're about, and what we want to do was crucial to me and my work.
Thank you both. Thanks for telling us about your journey and where this started and where you're going. So I just want to make the distinction. SAL, being a presenting organization, a fundraising organization, there are a different set of stakeholders. There's a mission to fundraise. There's a development office. There are ways that we have to think about resources, and that's an interesting positionality. It's a different place to be in than where For Culture is a funding organization or a granting, and there's power and privilege inherent in that work as well. But and Sal holds it as a major presenter of literary giants and producer of major programs in the public school space. I wanted to just make that distinction. So these two different perspectives on equity and how it impacts the world around you really helps us to consider what we do here at UW. There are a lot of fundraisers on the line now, a lot of people who work from different positions within this, so resource giving and fundraising specifically. So with that, Ruth, if you could talk a little bit more about where you see the key opportunities from that perspective as a sort of an organization that fundraises, where you see opportunities initiate deeper equity work within the organization and how you engage your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such a great question. And that's actually a really great distinction to make. Thank you for that, Leilani. And it's, early in our equity journey, I think one of the things that we did was we felt really strongly that we needed to be doing the work, and we were trepidatious about talking a whole lot about what we were doing. So in 2017, we committed that 50% or more of the speakers on all of our stages would be people of color. And we are the only presenting organization, a literary organization of our type in the country that's made a commitment like that. Our other organizations around the country, our peers have a much more, it's a few of their speakers or some or 20%. So we're the only one that said 50% or more, but we didn't talk about that publicly. We just started doing it. And one of the things that we heard from some of our donors was, you are a literary organization. It's not your job to be a social justice organization. It's not your job to be an equity first organization. So we started doing that work. And I think actually that was a mistake as we moved through the work that not talking about it explicitly allowed us, it didn't give us the chance to be accountable to the community. It also didn't give us a chance to be transparent about why we were doing what we were doing, why we thought it was important. And that was a real missed opportunity. And as we've moved along and gotten clearer in talking about our work and our equity work and our journey, we've actually found that it's attracted more energy and supporters to us when we're clear about it, as opposed to alienating folks, as some of our early donors and some board members even feared that it would, which has been, I think, a really important part of the journey. And then, you know, in terms of being accountable to communities and to listening, so as we started with that commitment and then really worked on having our audiences be more reflective of the Seattle community, more diverse, having more people of color, more young folks, and just a variety of more people in our audiences that historically hadn't been there. And as we began doing that work, then we began to hear from people and listening deeply that when they came, they were encountering volunteers who didn't look like them and ushers who didn't look like them, and they weren't feeling welcome. We heard concerns about accessibility. And so we answered some of those concerns with trainings for volunteers and talking with our presenting venue partners. Then we also began thinking about when we invite people as guests, where are they seated in the hall? What is their experience like? We started working with organizations to give away free tickets, which is an important thing to do, but then also thinking through, well, what's the experience like for people when they get to the hall? So it's layers and layers of this work. And then what we started a new strategic planning process a year ago in the fall, and we did a big set of community outreach, and we heard from about 800 different stakeholders, and we were so grateful for all that feedback. It was surveys and focus groups and interviews and conversations. And one of the things that we heard really strongly, 2 years ago, we launched a community access ticket program, which gave away free tickets, and it's about to start its third year. And we heard from a lot of folks that they didn't feel community access tickets were the right fit for them, but our ticketing levels, our prices were out of reach. And so in the coming year, we've added a $10 ticket at all events, or all series events, to make tickets more affordable, but not through the community access ticket program. So it's an iterative process of learning and trying things, and then asking people, how was that for you? How did you experience that? Our intent was to be welcoming, but what was the actual impact? How did you feel it? And then going back and learning and trying some more things and continuing on that way. And as we are looking to the future, we're looking at how do we diversify the volunteers who are at events? How do we make sure that we're cultivating a sense of belonging? So when people come to SAL events, they feel part of a community and welcome to that. And how do we do that on every level? Who's on our stages? Who's in our audiences? How we're communicating about things? Who's on our staff? Who's on our board? And we've had some movement on all those different metrics, and more to do and more work to do. And I think one of the gifts of equity work and being really responsive to communities, as Brian was saying, is that the more you are in conversation with communities, the more there is trust, so people can tell you what worked and what didn't. And then when all of us actually use that feedback and make changes, then there's an opportunity for closer connection, and then moving towards actually creating something together, which is the most meaningful thing any of us can do. And sorry, I got excited. I have lots to say about that. That's enough for me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I ask you a question? Oh, sorry. Leilani, is it all right if I ask her a question? I'm just curious what the percentage of POC presenters was before you set the 50% target, and just what, like, why 50%? How did that come about? What did that look like internally? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would have to go back and do the metrics. I mean, it bounced around between 10, 25, 30% over the prior years. There were always a diversity of people on our stages, and we looked to present people of color and also immigrant voices, queer voices, and trying to make sure that we had diversity throughout our series, but there was never a specific commitment to it. And 50% was just something when we thought about, okay, how do we take this really seriously, both for who we're presenting, who we're giving the microphone to, but also because our big literary series events are in Benares Hall, and they sell a lot of books, and they, it also is a message we want to send to publishers, because ultimately our aim, we'd like to be part of changing the narrative in New York and other places about what gets published and what is their value and demand for. So if we're demonstrating, we are filling Benares Hall for a series that is 50% authors of color, there is a demand for these books and they need to be published, then ultimately, hopefully that begins to open the whole ecosystem of what authors are being published, what literature is showing up. So it was both for our intent for what's happening here in Seattle and an intent around what are we doing for the larger ecosystem to make change, because publishing historically has been very white and very male. So those two pieces were at work.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that as well. I think too, it's at least 50%, right? The default being, if you dip below that, then we're defaulting to white, white authors, who get promoted, who get visibility. So that's I guess the distinction I'd like to make. And then Brian, I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about this, about thinking of from a funding perspective for a grantor, for the way that you design grants to serve the community. What have been the key opportunities and the key conversations that you've had to advance equity in that space that's making an impact from the funding perspective?
Yeah. I think there are a few opportunities or key features of the work that we're involved in right now at For Culture. One of those is a commitment from the organization around racial equity work. And I think a lot of that commitment comes from the leadership. So it was 2 years ago, I was hired as executive director, and I'm terrible in interview. You can ask anybody who's ever interviewed me. I am just honest to a fault. I say what I'm going to do. I tell people, if you don't want it, do not hire me. I'm not going to make your life easy. I'm going to demand change, and this is what you're getting. So know what you're getting. So I came in, as I said, with a really clear, at least personal mandate. And then I think there was just transparency about my commitment to racial equity. And by racial equity, what I really mean is aligning resources against disparities. So for me, I keep it really, really simple. I like data. When I see disparities that are mostly and often right along racial lines, those are things that I want to move and reallocate resources. And as a funder, I have the ability to do that in a much more simplistic way. So commitment is one of those first opportunities that I feel like I brought. The other part, and I would say these are two parallel tracks that are essential, and that is education and action. And I think that there's often, at least within the cultural sector, there's a trend to, when you first begin to try and transform an organization, that you get stuck in the inertia of education. We need racial equity training. We need workshops. We need allyship training. And that's all true, right? Bringing people to an understanding about the past wrongs that have occurred, right, is a crucial component, that truth element, before you can actually make change. And so I was all for that. We went through a really long and an ongoing process of education, myself included, where we brought in consultants, we brought in speakers, and started a book club, and we had a racial equity team, and all that's fantastic. But we give away, right, about $20 million a year. So us being stuck in a space of educating ourselves does not actually bring about racially equitable outcomes, which is what I really care about. It's not the theoretical, it's not the promise, it's the outcomes that I care about. So as we were going through this educational process and continue to go through that, what I wanted to do is to really codify and to lay out what we believed in as an organization when it came to racial equity. And for me, I think about, if I get hit by a bus, what's left after I leave? I've got energy, I've got passion, I've got leadership, but have I built into the organization ways in which a fundamental commitment to racial equity work can stay? And for me, that always begins with the mission. And as I said, our mission now fully, directly, and explicitly states that we will focus on racial equity in our work. We also redid our mission. And I think really, really crucial, and somebody had brought this up in the comments, is the values of an organization. And I would say the values of an organization are a backstop when you get stuck, when you are uncertain, when you are in the tall grass and you're not sure which direction to go. You have to be able to say, these are our values. This is our commitment to the constituency that we serve. So I feel like one of the opportunities that we had at For Culture that I really jumped on is, let us set, or I should say redesign, a foundation that articulates what we believe in when it comes to racial equity work, and all the while continuing that education. And I'll say one of the things that I think is just essential from a leadership standpoint, is that you're always going to have, it's either your board or your staff or constituents or donors that are going to question, and they're going to say, is it right? Is it now? Is now the time? And I think it is just crucial as a leader that you are there to say, we will do this. We will move in this direction. I'll partner with you. I'll talk with you. We'll figure out how to best do it, but we are not going backward. And there's so many times that I feel like through this process, and it will continue, where I've just had to say, we are not moving backward, not on my watch, not at this moment. The opportunity is too great and the need is too big for us to question necessary evolution that we're making around racial equity. So I feel like those are the greatest opportunities that I tried to seize on.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. And I agree with you. This is disruptive work. Often it's disruptive to the status quo. It's agitation. It's not, it's discomfort, it's change, it's transformation. And a lot of it, if you're not moving forward and there isn't a little bit of agitation, then it's not working, which gets to a question actually we got from someone who's watching. So the question is, in terms of racial equity in an organization, what is the end game or major goal? This is it might be a complicated answer that I would give, but I'm curious and I want to put it out to you both to answer. As far as, is it equal opportunity, the question says, or equal outcomes or something else altogether? Either one of you.
Do you want to go first, Ruth?
No, I want you to go first. That's okay.
Yeah, it's a tough question. For me, I have some really specific outcomes that I want my agency, and that is the redistribution of funds to cultural organizations and cultural workers that have historically been marginalized from cultural philanthropy opportunities, whether that's government agencies, family foundations, individual donors, what have you. I believe that my mark of success at For Culture and within cultural philanthropy overall will be, have I been able to move money, period. That's the outcome that I want. And how you do that, especially within the political realm, is incredibly difficult. But to me, that's the outcome that I want personally. For my agency, what I really want, and I talk about headspace, and Leilani knows this, I talk about headspace. The outcome is always going to change and it's going to morph. But as Ruth said, I feel like your targets for what you're looking for have always got to be set in communication with the community that you actually want to serve and you want to influence. And I think that takes two things. The first one is it takes humility to say, we do not know. And even like when you're in conversations like this, or perhaps you're a more progressive organization and people say, oh, you got it, right? Oh, that's a woke organization. They're having awareness about racial equity. I think if you let that go to your head and you do not stay in a state of humility, that's a problem. So the headspace of being humble. Also, I always talk about active listening. And it's sometimes I think, especially within the cultural sector, and this is true within education, the best thing you can do is just shut the hell up. Like, stop talking. We're all brilliant. I'm sure everybody on this damn call has a BA or an MA or a PhD, and we have wonderful ways to phrase things, and we have wonderful ways to abstract, right? Like the things that happen within our country that are uncomfortable. But to me, being quiet and having a good set of questions and listening and let that influence what you do is really, really critical. So for me, that's the headspace. It's humility, it's active listening, and then the last part is acting on what you hear in a way that requires accountability. So you've got to say what it is you're going to do. You've got to make sure that your constituency knows what it is that you're going to do. And then you've got to have some type of check-in. And that's why I say active listening. It's just a cycle that repeats. What should we be doing? Who should we be? Here's what we heard. Here's what we're attempting to do. Now, how did we do? How did we listen? Did we implement what you're asking? So it's just kind of that continual cycle. And I think that's more a headspace. The like strategies and tactics are always going to change every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years. But that headspace is where I think an organization has to be.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Thinking about that headspace, being in community, staying humble and staying quiet, listening and creating that positive feedback loop requires a lot of trust. We talked about that in yesterday's session, about building trust in community and being accountable. So thank you for that. Ruth, I'd love for you to answer that question as far as, is there end games? And I'd like to, thinking about goals, metrics, and all of that. It's so specific to the climate, the environment, the space you're in, the organization, your stakeholders, and the nature of your work. So it might shift as far as from my perspective as a board member of SAL, but would love for you to answer that.
Yeah, gosh, I want to start by thanking Brian for that, a really inspiring answer. I think that was such a great way, a beautiful way to frame it. I think for SAL, for SAL as an organization, for our public programs, I think the end game for us is we want our audience to look like Seattle's audience. We want it to be a welcoming place for everybody. And then beyond that, I want it to be a space where we are catalyzing conversations that move people towards equity work. That's something that we know anecdotally happens sometimes, and I would like that to be ultimately what's happening, that it's not just people listening to an author, but it's actually creating community, creating belonging, creating change. For our work in schools, I would love it if every student had an opportunity to feel like their story and voice matters, and they got a chance to tell their story and it got amplified and listened to. And ultimately, I want a world where race is not a determinant of educational outcomes or health outcomes for people. And that's, I feel like, the big thing that we all are working towards. And we each have a place to play in that, and Sal has a part in that. But I think it's important, I find it really important to hold that Sal succeeding in that is just part of a bigger success that we're all working towards, and that just world where there are great outcomes and where institutionalized racism is not determining people's health and opportunities will take all the different organizations and all the work moving forwards. I'm so curious, I'd love to know, Leilani, what do you think for the university? What success look like?
That's a big question and a good question. And I go back to, there is a broader vision, and I think that it's held by a lot of people. But I think success is measured in, day-to-day goals, yearly goals, and that could change. And if we're responsive, it could change. So I can't know what success looks like for the university quite yet. I can guess at it, but I think for now, making sure that, I can come in and have a voice and help shape change, then there's a movement towards something better. And I don't like to call it success or an end game or end goal, just something better for now. Thanks for throwing that back at me. I appreciate it. All my leaders on the line. And with that, we'll go to the next question, which is a great one. And it's actually one I had on my list. So thanks to whoever put this out. And it says, how can those of us who are not in leadership, big L leadership, help our organization have more leaders of color? Or how can we lead from this space that we're in? If you're not in leadership. And I guess this view or your perspective as leaders of your organizations, thinking about your staff, thinking about your stakeholders, and when you were not always in leadership in your journey.
I guess I can start. There's a saying that you can't really make change at an organization if you're in the soup line. So I think that there are limits, right, to the demands that you can make if you're leading from the middle or leading from whatever the terms are. So I think being cognizant that it's easy for me to be much more demanding. It's easy for me to get in the face of a board member. It is not as easy when your job is much more on the line perhaps than mine is. So I think that's something that you have to be cognizant of and aware of, because you gotta be in the game if you want to fight. So I would start with that. The second thing is I would say push within that realm that you have, such that you are comfortable when you put your head on your pillow at night. For me, before I became executive director, I've been a nuisance every place that I've ever been. I mean, really, like a nuisance. You know this, but I'm honest about that when an organization hires me. And I think that that's really essential. So if you're in the job now, or you're moving up, or you're getting a promotion, or you're going to a new organization or a new department, I think just being really clear about who you are and what you bring. And I think it's not just saying, hey, I'm going to be like a thorn in the side, but instead saying, here, I'm really clear about what my values are and how I think that these can benefit and help, whether it's the department, right, the entire university, or whatever organization you're part of. And then the other part is like personal relationships. I think leading from the middle, or whatever term we want to use, is so rarely about being the most vocal in the boardroom or in the staff meeting or in the department. To me, it's about personal relationships that you forge with those people who perhaps, right, have greater seniority or a bigger title, such that you have a relationship of trust with them, and you are then offering counsel to them. You're there to think through like all the difficulties, because so often when you're a leader, right, and you have a staff member who comes and says, you should absolutely do this, do it tomorrow, it's the right way. And your job is to say, we've got to look at this on balance. Here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the implications, here are the consequences that are going to come from this. And I think if you as a staff member have the ability to bring, right, both a problem, a solution, and an analysis of the implications of that solution, that is an incredibly useful gift that you can give your leader. And once you have your leader's ear, your department head's ear, your dean's ear, you can absolutely make change, because they're looking at you as a thought partner. So those are my suggestions for how you might affect change if you are not right at the top of your organizational hierarchy.
Thank you for that. That's great, leadership strategies from different, different positionalities and different positions within in this very, very, hierarchical space that we are in, especially at the university. So I'll throw that to you as well. And then I have another question about metrics from the audience. And so Ruth, if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And one of the things we've been thinking a lot about at SAL is how each area of our work and how equity shows up in all the different decisions, and how everybody in the organization, every single person is making decisions throughout their day. And almost always there is an opportunity either in those decisions to move towards equitable outcomes or to not make that choice. And so really thinking about, even if you are not the head decision maker in your organization or your department or your area, I would bet $1 zillion you still have choices that you're making that have an opportunity to think about how equity is showing up in those choices. So I think it's important on all different levels. And I do want to go back to something that Brian said earlier and that Leilani referenced about funders and the role that funders play in this environment. And I think there are different authorizing elements for this work, and that I just want to thank For Culture and also the Office of Arts and Culture and also Arts Fund for their early commitment to racial equity and saying without any equivocy that this is important, because that for many organizations that were having conversations and dialogue and questions about that gave an external reason for us to embrace this work. And I think that is super important and valuable. So the other thing that I think many of us can do, even if we're not in control, is to be that authorizing energy for other people within our organizations, within our community.
Thank you so much. I think that the last 6 months have been a time for this transformational leadership, and we're seeing voices hearing voices that we haven't heard before, seeing people that we haven't heard from before. So opportunities for leadership are sort of swelling up around especially equity, anti-racism work, and bringing some balance to the system. Can you talk a little bit about how your work has changed, or if it has at all in the last 6 months, in relation to leadership, or what you're seeing, or where things are coming from in relation to the anti-racism and equity work you're doing within your organization? Ruth.
Sure, that's a really good question. Clearly for all of us, it's a different world that we are in ways that I think are both challenging because we're all working from home and we have to navigate technology in different ways, and in ways that are really exciting because I think the broad-based movement towards racial justice that we're seeing allows us all to be bolder in our work than we might have been a few months ago, which I think is a really exciting opportunity. For us, we've been thinking a lot about in our work with schools, what does it mean to center writers of color and students of color? And for example, when the shutdown happened, one of the things that we decided immediately was that we would commit to pay our teaching artists whether or not the schools ever reopened, even though we had no idea how we were going to pay for that, because we knew that they were our most marginalized community and we thought it was really important and we wanted to give them the space to figure out how do they support schools. Now, as we're looking at who the heck knows what's going to happen with schools in the fall, we're thinking about how do we reach students who haven't re-engaged with their schools and what's our role in trying to make sure that we're serving the students who are furthest from institutions and the educational opportunities. So thinking about that. Another thing that popped up for us right after the uprisings in response to George Floyd's murder, we were bringing Dr. Carol Anderson, which we were really excited about, and Brian Carter, we were really lucky, did the Q&A with and was in conversation with her. And as we were moving towards that, we were selling online tickets because we moved our events online, and we thought really quickly about resources because I think a lot of times at its base, equity work is about resources. And so we made the decision that from that point forward, that all of the online ticket sales would go to organizations working for justice and centering Black community. And for us, that was a really exciting, it's the first time we've ever done anything like that, and an exciting opportunity for us to think about, we don't have limitless resources, we are not a funder, and yet also we have access to audiences, we have access to resources, we have access to power. How are we sharing those? How are we showing up? So that was an exciting learning place for us, and hopefully a place where we'll keep going and keep learning and do more.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Appreciate that and making those commitments, even though they might not be popular, they might not have all the support they need, but ensuring that communities are taken care of, or the work that the privileged space that you have is utilized in a way that draws on, brings, again, more balance to the system is great direction for Sal. And Brian, I'm going to turn the question for you, but also I'm going to flip it a little bit because I have a question from the audience about your history background and how that helps you define or tear down systems that exist within the country, I guess, within your sphere of influence, the county, the cultural sector, and understanding history. So I work for the Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity, and that's a 50-year history organization founded in an activism for Black and Brown students at the University of Washington. So that informs the legacy of that particular organization, and it has transformed, and contributed to the work toward equity within the University of Washington for the last 50 years, and it's going to evolve and change, and how different iterations of that come forth. So I know I'm steeped in a historical space often within the 150-year history of the university at large. So I know that informs my work in this. I'm curious, and our audience is curious about how you use your history to move forward.
What everybody's been going through amidst the George Floyd murders and the global protests that are happening, there's this idea that like something different is happening. There's a greater understanding, and to me, it's more a revealing of something that has always been there. And maybe that's just because I'm a Black man, maybe that's just the way I was raised. But this idea that race and racism have a disproportionate impact on, as Ruth said, so many different life outcomes and health outcomes, and the potential of particular groups, to me, is a truth. And I think what you run into often is folks that have not experienced that. And so they don't quite trust it. Oh, you believe that occurred and that race was a major element in that occurring. Well, I'm not quite so sure, because that's not really my experience, or that's not something that I've seen. And I think what history always gives you is the ability to stitch together other incidents that are similar in nature to what you're trying to describe at that particular moment. And I think being able to establish a trend or a pattern or provide context for folks using the stories and the narratives of the past allows people to trust more what they're seeing, even though their data sample is much more limited. So I feel like that's the most effective use of history when it comes to racial equity work, is that what I am telling you, right, and I'll give you an example just from my field, is that POC organizations, I think it's something like this is POC cultural organizations around the country, receive 4% of all cultural philanthropy dollars. Well, is that true? Is that accurate? And I think being able to go, right, and provide a context of the why, right, starting with the Ford Foundation, the way in which it funded, and how the NEA funded, how they have followed this consistent pattern of funding large, urban, legacy white institutions, allows people to say, okay, I think what you're saying is actually true. So for me, history is always about context. It's about proving a point to those who might not trust what their eyes are telling them. And I think that's often effective. If you can give 5 examples of a current happenstance and the way in which that links to like the wrongs that have occurred in the past, I think that's an effective mode of advocacy.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. Having both worked in a history museum, we've just drawn this so much in our work, and seeing how it's evolving and moving forward. It's maybe new tactics, maybe new words, maybe new strategies, but the story of movement for greater equity is the same. We have about 10 minutes, so I have one more really poignant question, and then we're going to do closing thoughts. And the question is, and you're both leaders, what are effective ways to hold leaders accountable in this space? And what are some examples of large and small acts that have moved the needle? And, I'll say, at the University of Washington, it's a predominantly white leadership space. And so thinking about that and the positionality and power that people hold who have historically marginalized identities, holding leaders accountable from any space or any identity is difficult, but might be especially difficult for some. So keeping that in mind, can you answer or address that question about how to hold leaders accountable in equity and inclusion?
Mm-hmm. Please feel free, Ruth.
Oh gosh. I think that's a really great question. SAL is a white-led organization historically, and it's still true, even though we have more diversity on our staff. Our leadership team is all white women, and that's a really important question. And I think one of the ways that we have held ourselves accountable and have been accountable is hearing from the community. And we have been, I always think of a staff member who talked about, the response to feedback is always thank you for the feedback, even if it's really hard to hear. The feedback is a gift. And over my time at SAL, we've gotten a lot of really challenging feedback from the community. And I think that listening to the community is the most important way that leaders and organizations can be accountable. And the most important way that all of us can help hold leaders accountable is to give that feedback. And that process of listening with humility and learning and continuing to give and receive feedback is how we all, I think, move forward with accountability. I'm curious to hear, Brian, what you'll have to say.
Sure. Accountability is a tough one. I think I'll go back to what I said about like leading from the middle before. And when you call somebody a leader, right, I think you've got to kind of flip that on its head. You've got to personalize it, right? Like I'm just Brian, right? Like I'm a kid from Yakima. If you want to tell me something, if you want to critique my leadership, if you want to tell me to go in a different direction, I've got to, number one, probably like you. Number two, I've probably got to trust you and actually think that you have some of my own interests at heart. So I think trust and a personal relationship, and not just an attack, but instead, right, realizing that like your greatest ability to influence change is if you have the ear of somebody who trusts you. So that's my first thing. The second thing that I would say is I feel like if you're unable to those really strong personal relationships with leaders that you're trying to hold accountable, you need a system of accountability. And I think that takes it takes building. So it's not just me, right, in my particular position, calling you out or the leadership out, but I am helping to build a culture of accountability. So at my own organization, right, there's a racial equity team that formed right away. And I felt like that was a way in which we could hold ourselves, like me as a leader, our board, our advisory committees, accountable. It was a vehicle for staff to put forward what they thought accountability looked like without having to be out on a limb on their own with like the potential, like there's always a potential of blowback or consequences that it comes when you critique. So I think that like culture of accountability and being really active in the creation of that is really helpful. So I guess it's two ends of the spectrum. One, it's either like really deeply personal and influential, and the other one is give yourself a little bit of cover by creating whatever the systems are, right? Whether it's a task force, a working group, a board subcommittee, a departmental group that talks about accountability overall, and you are pushing that, right? What do the tactics of accountability look like? What are the outcomes and what are the pivots that are required through that accountability structure? And I think that gives some protection. So those are my two suggestions.
Thank you so much. That really, rings true the work we're trying to do in advancement. I haven't some comment. I have another question, but I'm not going to be able to get to it. But thank you both for answering that and addressing that. Accountability is a major part of this work. It's one facet of it among all of the others, and we're hoping to map that out in university advancement, especially with the new Equity Council. The work's already being done in the Alumni Association, other parts of the university advancement world. And that is, it's a major piece of this, so I'm really grateful for the answers to that question. And I don't think I have any more questions coming up, and we're coming up on time. If anybody has any questions for me following up, there was a question about staffing that I'm happy to address, especially if it's very specific to you, Todd. But otherwise, I'm just so grateful for this conversation. I think, again, it reinforces our belief and commitments. There's a world or environment and community around the University of Washington that's dedicated to this work, from our literary organizations to our major county, cultural funding organizations. So knowing that we have we have an ecosystem here. We have people, leaders in the community that are committed to equity, social justice, anti-racism, and truth telling and agitation. This is the work that we have to do, and it's not always easy, but it's definitely moving forward. And it's just, you can't go backward, you're moving forward. So without further ado, I don't know how to close this properly. I'll defer to Ellen, but thank you so much, Brian and Ruth, for your time and your words today. Very illuminating conversation. Thank you both.